Archivists in New Orleans found an 1892 photograph of 5 brothers. Zooming closer made them flee in terror. The humidity clung to Sarah Mitchell's skin like a second layer as she descended the narrow stone steps into the basement of the New Orleans Historical Archive. It was late August, and even underground, the Louisiana heat seemed to follow, mixing with the musty smell of aged paper and forgotten histories. She'd been working as a senior archivist for nearly 7 years, but this particular assignment felt different. The private collection donated by the Beaumont estate had arrived 3 weeks ago, sealed in deteriorating leather trunks that hadn't been opened since 1923. Sarah adjusted her white cotton gloves and carefully lifted another stack of photographs from the second trunk. Most were typical late 19th century portraits, stiff families posed in their Sunday best, faded sepia tones capturing moments that meant everything to people now long dead. Her colleague, Marcus Chen, worked at the adjacent table, methodically cataloguing documents with the precision that had made him invaluable to the archive. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their sterile glow a stark contrast to the warm gaslight that would have illuminated these images when they were first developed. She was about to set aside another family portrait when something made her pause. 5 young men, brothers perhaps, stood in descending height order against what appeared to be the iron fence of a French Quarter courtyard. The photograph was dated on the back in fading ink. March 1892. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't the formal poses or period clothing, but something in their expressions. While most Victorian photographs showed subjects with neutral or serious faces due to long exposure times, these 5 brothers had something else in their eyes. Fear, resignation, she couldn't quite place it. "Marcus, can you take a look at this?" Sarah called across the climate-controlled room. Her voice echoed slightly off the brick walls. "There's something odd about this one." Marcus pushed back from his workstation, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. He was 42, 10 years older than Sarah, with graying temples and reading glasses perpetually perched on his nose. He'd come to New Orleans from San Francisco after his divorce, seeking a fresh start in a city that honored the past while somehow always feeling vibrantly alive. He leaned over Sarah's shoulder, studying the photograph through his glasses. "Beaumont brothers, probably," he said, his breath smelling faintly of the coffee they'd been drinking since 6 that morning. The estate papers mentioned 5 sons. "Let me check the manifest." He returned to his laptop and scrolled through the digital inventory they'd been building. Here it is. Thomas, William, James, Robert, and Edward Beaumont. Ages ranged from 16 to 28 in 1892. Prominent family in the shipping business. Father was Alexandre Beaumont. Mother was Celestine. Sarah picked up the magnifying glass they used for detailed examination of damaged documents. As she moved it slowly across the photograph, focusing on each brother's face in turn, her heart began to beat faster. There was something written on the background wall behind them, partially obscured by shadows and the limitations of 19th century photography. She leaned closer, adjusting the magnification. The letters were crude, scratched or painted onto the brick wall in what appeared to be a desperate, uneven hand. She could make out partial words, help and what might have been imprisoned, but it was what she noticed next that made her blood run cold. Around each brother's neck, so faint she'd almost missed it, were marks, thin lines that could have been shadows or photographic artifacts, but as she examined them more closely, they looked disturbingly like restraints. Ropes or chains, barely visible, but undeniably present. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice tight, "I need you to scan this at the highest resolution. Right now." Something in her tone made him move without questioning. They had a specialized scanner for fragile documents, capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. Marcus handled the photograph with practiced care, placing it face down on the scanner bed. The machine hummed to life, its light bar moving slowly across the image. 3 minutes later, the digital file appeared on his monitor. Sarah stood behind him as he zoomed in, the pixels expanding to reveal details that had been hidden for over a century. What they saw made both of them instinctively step back from the screen. The restraints were real, metal chains that caught the light in ways that couldn't be photographic artifacts. But worse, much worse, were the details visible in the shadows behind the brothers. Dozens of faces, gaunt and hollow-eyed, pressed against what appeared to be barred windows. Some were children, all were African-American. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered. "This isn't a family portrait. This is documentation of something else entirely." Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about New Orleans history, about the Beaumont family, about what could explain this photograph. The official records showed the Beaumont Shipping Company as a legitimate business, importing sugar and cotton, exporting manufactured goods. But as she stared at those faces in the shadows, at the chains around the brothers' necks, at the desperate message scratched into the wall, she understood they'd stumbled onto something that had been deliberately hidden. "We need to report this," she said, reaching for her phone. But Marcus grabbed her wrist gently. "Report what exactly?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "We don't know what we're looking at. This could be anything. A staged photograph, some kind of historical reenactment, theater production." "Theater productions don't use real chains," Sarah countered. "And those faces in the background, Marcus, those are real people, imprisoned people." They were interrupted by the sound of the basement door opening at the top of the stairs. Heavy footsteps descended, and Sarah quickly minimized the image on Marcus's screen, replacing it with the inventory spreadsheet. Their supervisor, Dr. Helen Carr, appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She was a severe woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a tight bun and an expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse and believed none of them. "Still working on the Beaumont collection?" Helen asked, her heels clicking on the floor as she approached. "I need your preliminary catalogue by Friday. The board wants to know if there's anything worth featuring in next spring's exhibition. We're making good progress," Marcus said smoothly, his years of experience with difficult supervisors evident in his calm demeanor. "Mostly standard family documents and photographs. Nothing extraordinary so far." Helen nodded, seeming satisfied. She glanced at the photograph still lying on Sarah's table but didn't pick it up. "Good. The Beaumont family has been generous donors over the years. I'd hate to disappoint them with a lackluster assessment of their ancestors' papers." She turned and walked back toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom. "Lock up properly when you leave. Security has been having issues with the card readers on this level." After Helen's footsteps faded and the basement door closed, Sarah and Marcus exchanged looks. "Why did you lie to her?" Sarah asked. "Because something tells me we need to understand what this is before we involve anyone else," Marcus replied. He pulled the image back up on his screen. "If the Beaumont family is still influential enough to make donations that the board cares about, and if this photograph shows what I think it shows, then we're looking at something people have worked very hard to keep buried." Sarah felt a chill despite the basement's warmth. "We need to find out what happened to these brothers and to the people in those windows." They worked in silence for the next hour, Sarah carefully searching through the remaining documents in the trunk while Marcus began cross-referencing the Beaumont name in the archive's digital databases. What he found was both fascinating and troubling. The Beaumont Shipping Company had indeed been a major commercial enterprise in late 19th century New Orleans, but it had collapsed suddenly in April 1892, just 1 month after the photograph was dated. The 5 brothers had all disappeared within a week of each other, never to be seen again. The official records listed their deaths as a yellow fever outbreak. But no bodies were ever recovered, no funerals held. "Yellow fever in April?" Sarah said skeptically when Marcus shared his findings. The major outbreaks were always in summer and fall. Exactly, Marcus agreed. And there's something else. He pulled up a newspaper article from the Times-Democrat, dated April 15th, 1892. 5 workers from the Beaumont warehouses disappeared the same week as the brothers, all former slaves who'd been working on the docks since Reconstruction. The article barely mentions it, just a small paragraph noting they'd abandoned their posts. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the photograph again. The faces in the shadows seemed to stare back at her with increasing clarity, as if the act of being seen after so many years had given them renewed presence. She noticed something else now, something she'd missed before. In the corner of the photograph, partially cut off by the frame, was what appeared to be a document posted on the wall. She couldn't make out the text, but there was an official seal visible. "Can you enhance this section?" she asked Marcus, pointing to the corner. He manipulated the digital image, isolating the area and increasing the contrast. The seal became clearer, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was a bill of sale. Not for goods or property in the traditional sense, but for human beings. Even in 1892, 30 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, someone had been trading in human lives, and the Beaumont brothers had documented it. "They're whistleblowers," Marcus said softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's why they're in chains too. They tried to expose what their father was doing, and he imprisoned them with the others." "But why take the photograph?" Sarah wondered aloud. "Why document your own imprisonment?" Marcus zoomed out, looking at the full image again. "Because they knew they were going to die. This was their testimony, their proof. They wanted someone, someday, to know the truth." The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and in that moment of dimness, Sarah could have sworn the faces in the photograph's shadows moved. She blinked hard, telling herself it was exhaustion and stress. But the impression lingered. "We need to find out where this photograph was taken. If we can locate the building, maybe we can find evidence, documentation of what really happened." Marcus nodded, already pulling up historical maps of New Orleans on his laptop. The French Quarter has changed, but iron fences like that one were common in courtyards. If we can identify architectural details, we might be able to narrow it down. They worked past their scheduled end time, Sarah calling her husband Tom to say she'd be late. Marcus sending a text to his teenage daughter Amy that he'd pick up dinner on the way home. Neither mentioned the real reason for their delay, some unspoken agreement that this discovery needed to be handled carefully, privately, until they understood its full implications. It was nearly 8 in the evening when they finally locked the basement and emerged into the still sweltering New Orleans night. The French Quarter was alive with tourists and locals, jazz music drifting from open doorways, the smell of beignets and coffee mixing with the river's earthy scent. Sarah felt disoriented by the contrast between the vibrant present and the dark past they'd been immersed in all day. "Let's meet tomorrow at my place," Marcus suggested as they walked to their cars in the archive's small lot. "I have better equipment for image analysis, and we can work without worrying about Helen or anyone else looking over our shoulders." Sarah agreed, though part of her wanted to go straight home, take a long shower, and try to forget those haunted faces in the photograph. But she knew she wouldn't forget, couldn't forget. Those people had been waiting over a century to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have their suffering recognized. She owed them more than willful ignorance. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to Tom, listening to his steady breathing, trying to quiet her racing thoughts. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw those 5 brothers, standing in their descending height, chains around their necks, and behind them, the desperate faces of people who'd been erased from history. She thought about freedom, about how fragile it could be, about how even in a nation that claimed to value liberty above all else, there were always those willing to strip it away for profit or power. Around 3 in the morning, she got up and went to her home office, opening her laptop. She began searching for everything she could find about the Beaumont family, about New Orleans in the 1890s, about the dark spaces between official history and hidden truth. What she discovered made her blood run cold and convinced her that they'd only begun to uncover something far larger and more terrible than a single photograph could capture. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Marcus's house in the Garden District just after 9. He lived in a renovated shotgun double, the kind of narrow house unique to New Orleans, with rooms connected in a straight line from front to back. His daughter Amy had already left for her summer job at a bookstore in the quarter, and the house was quiet except for the hum of air conditioning fighting against the August heat. Marcus had set up his personal workstation in what had once been a bedroom, now converted into an office with professional-grade monitors and photography equipment. The 1892 photograph was already displayed on the largest screen, blown up to reveal every tiny detail. In the bright morning light streaming through the window, those details seemed even more damning. "I couldn't sleep," Sarah admitted, accepting the coffee Marcus offered her. "I spent half the night researching. The Beaumont Shipping Company had warehouses all over the city, but only one had a courtyard matching the architectural details in this photograph." Marcus leaned forward. "Where?" "Decatur Street, near the French Market. The building's still standing, actually. It's been converted into luxury apartments, but the courtyard is original. I checked historical photographs. The iron fence is identical." Marcus pulled up Google Maps, switching to Street View. They could see the building's facade, the courtyard entrance visible through an arched passageway. "We should go there, see if there's any physical evidence remaining." Sarah hesitated. "What if we're getting into something dangerous? If the Beaumont family is still influential, if there are people who want this history to stay buried, then we document everything," Marcus interrupted. "We create backups. We make sure multiple people know what we've found. But we can't just ignore this, Sarah. Those people in the photograph, they deserve to have their story told." She knew he was right, but fear still gnawed at her. It wasn't just fear for their safety, though that was part of it. It was fear of what else they might discover, of how deep the darkness might go. But she also knew that fear was how secrets stayed buried, how injustice remained unaddressed. Freedom, real freedom, required the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. They spent the morning analyzing the photograph with Marcus's professional software, enhancing different sections, measuring proportions, comparing architectural elements to historical records. With each new detail they uncovered, the story became clearer and more horrible. The faces in the windows numbered at least 30, possibly more. Some appeared to be children as young as 7 or 8. The chains around the brothers' necks were connected to a central post, suggesting they'd been displayed there, perhaps as a warning to others who might consider exposing the truth. Around noon, Marcus's phone rang. It was Helen Carr, their supervisor. Her voice on the speaker was clipped and angry. "Where are you two? You're both scheduled to be at the archive. We have donors touring at 2. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. Marcus cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Helen. I had a family emergency. Sarah was helping me deal with it. We'll be in first thing tomorrow." There was a long pause. "What kind of emergency?" "Personal medical issue," Marcus said smoothly. "I'd rather not discuss it over the phone." Another pause, longer this time. "Fine, but I need you both in my office tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. We need to discuss your commitment to this position." After Helen hung up, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "She's suspicious." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "or maybe we're just being paranoid. Either way, we need to move faster. If she starts asking questions about what we've been working on, if she looks at what we scanned." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the implications. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Tom, telling him she'd be late again, that something important had come up at work. He was understanding, as always, but she could hear the concern in his voice. She hated lying to him, but how could she explain what they'd found without sounding insane? By early afternoon, they were ready to visit the Decatur Street location. Marcus packed his professional camera equipment, and Sarah brought her own phone and a small digital recorder. They needed documentation, proof of anything they might discover. The drive to the French Quarter took only 15 minutes, but to Sarah it felt much longer, each block bringing them closer to something she both dreaded and felt compelled to confront. The building on Decatur Street was exactly as it had appeared in historical photographs, though now painted a cheerful yellow, with modern windows and balconies added to the upper floors. The courtyard entrance was secured by a heavy wooden gate, but through the iron bars they could see into the space beyond. The flagstones were old, probably original, and the iron fence from the photograph was still there, though now decorative rather than functional. "Can I help you?" A voice behind them made both Sarah and Marcus jump. They turned to find an elderly black woman regarding them with sharp, intelligent eyes. She was dressed in a simple cotton dress despite the heat and carried a canvas shopping bag filled with vegetables from the French market. "We're historians," Sarah explained quickly. "We're researching the buildings in this area, their original uses and owners." The woman's expression didn't change. "You're looking at the old Beaumont warehouse. My grandmother worked there, back before it closed. Not a good place. Bad things happened there." Sarah's heart raced. "Your grandmother worked there? Do you know what kind of bad things?" The woman studied them for a long moment, as if deciding whether they could be trusted. Then she nodded toward a small cafe across the street. "Buy me a coffee, and I'll tell you what I know. My name is Josephine. Josephine Winters." They sat in the cafe's air-conditioned interior, the ceiling fans rotating lazily overhead as Josephine stirred sugar into her chicory coffee. She was 86 years old, she told them, and her grandmother had been just 10 when she worked at the Beaumont warehouse in the 1890s. "The work wasn't the shipping business everyone thought it was," Josephine said quietly. "That was a front. What they really did was traffic people. Black folks who'd been freed but were still vulnerable, still desperate. They'd promise jobs in other cities and passage to new lives, then disappear them. Some got sold into labor camps in Texas and Arkansas. Others just vanished completely." Marcus had his phone out, recording with Josephine's permission. "How did your grandmother escape?" "She didn't, at first. She was there when the Beaumont brothers tried to set everyone free." Josephine's eyes grew distant, remembering stories passed down through generations. The sons found out what their father was doing. They tried to expose it, went to the authorities. But the authorities were paid off, so the brothers freed everyone they could one night, but Alexandre Beaumont caught them. He chained his own sons up with the remaining captives, sent the message that nobody crosses him, not even his own blood. "What happened to them all?" Sarah asked, though she feared she knew the answer. Josephine's jaw tightened. "Fire. Alexandre Beaumont set that warehouse on fire with everyone inside. His own sons, 27 imprisoned people, including my grandmother, all of them. But my grandmother survived. She was small, managed to squeeze through a broken window in the back. The brothers, they pushed the children toward that window before the smoke got too thick. Saved 4 lives before they died. My grandmother was one of them." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she listened. The photograph made sense now. Horrible sense. The brothers had documented their imprisonment, knowing they might not survive, wanting the truth to outlive them. "Why isn't this in any historical records?" she asked. "Because powerful people made sure it wasn't," Josephine replied. Alexandre Beaumont had connections all the way to the governor's office. The fire was ruled an accident. The missing people were said to have fled the city to escape yellow fever. The brothers were given a quiet burial, their names on a monument in one of the cemeteries. Nobody asked questions because nobody wanted the answers. Marcus leaned forward. "The photograph we found, it shows your grandmother?" Could you identify her? Josephine nodded slowly. I think I could. She described me what that courtyard looked like many times, made sure I knew the truth even if the history books lied. That's how our freedom stays real, she said. By remembering what it cost, by honoring those who died for it. They showed Josephine the enhanced digital image on Marcus's phone. She studied it carefully, then pointed to a small face visible in one of the windows. That's her. That's my grandmother Estelle. She was just a child, but she remembered everything. She lived to be 93, told her story to anyone who would listen, though most people didn't believe her. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. We need to make sure this story gets told properly. Your grandmother's testimony, the photograph, all of it needs to be part of the official historical record. Josephine looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. You understand what you're risking? The Beaumont family still has power in this city. They own property, sit on boards, make donations to museums and universities. They've spent over a century making sure this story stays buried. You bring it to light, you're going to make enemies. I know, Sarah said quietly. But those people in the photograph, your grandmother, the Beaumont brothers who died trying to do the right thing, they deserve better than silence. They deserve to be remembered. Josephine reached across the table and took Sarah's hand in her own weathered one. Then you do this right. You document everything. You find every scrap of evidence you can. And you make sure enough people know the truth that it can't be buried again. That's how we honor the dead. That's how we protect the living. They spent another hour with Josephine, recording her grandmother's story in detail, taking notes on every name she could remember, every detail that had been passed down. When they finally left the cafe, Sarah felt both energized and terrified. They had first-hand testimony now, not just a photograph, but a living connection to the events of 1892. It made the horror more real, but it also made their responsibility more clear. As they walked back to Marcus's car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Stop asking questions about the Beaumont family. This is your only warning. She showed it to Marcus, whose face paled. We're being watched. They looked around the crowded street, at the tourists taking photographs, the locals going about their business, the countless windows overlooking the sidewalk. Anyone could be monitoring them. The fear Sarah had felt earlier intensified, but so did her determination. Whoever sent that text, whatever power they represented, they were afraid. Afraid of the truth, afraid of what would happen when it came to light. And that fear meant the truth mattered. We don't stop, Marcus said firmly. We're too far in now, but we need to be smart about this. We back up everything to the cloud. We share our findings with trusted people. We make sure there are copies that can't be destroyed. Sarah nodded, already thinking about who they could trust, how they could build a network of safety. Tom, her husband, was an investigative journalist for the Times-Picayune. He'd know how to handle sensitive information, how to protect sources, how to make sure a story couldn't be suppressed. Marcus's ex-wife was a lawyer in San Francisco, specializing in civil rights cases. Between them, they could build protections, create redundancies that would make it impossible to silence the truth. But first, they needed more evidence. The photograph and Josephine's testimony were powerful, but they needed documentation that would stand up to legal and historical scrutiny. They needed to find whatever remained of the warehouse fire, whatever records the Beaumont family might have kept, whatever traces of those 30 people might still exist in the historical record. That evening, back at Marcus's house, they uploaded everything to encrypted cloud storage, created multiple backups, and began drafting a detailed report of their findings. Sarah called Tom and explained what they'd discovered, swearing him to secrecy for now. He was skeptical at first, the journalist in him needing to verify every claim, but when she sent him the enhanced photograph and Josephine's recorded testimony, his tone changed. "This is massive," he said over the phone. "If we can prove this, if we can document this level of corruption and cover-up, it's not just a historical story. It's about how power protects itself, how truth gets suppressed, how freedom is always under threat from those who profit from oppression." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "And that's why we have to be careful. That's why we need your help." Tom promised to reach out to some of his contacts, historians and archivists who might have access to records they couldn't get through official channels. He'd do it quietly, carefully, but he'd help them build their case. Sarah felt marginally better knowing they weren't alone in this anymore, that they had allies who understood the stakes. She spent another sleepless night, tossing beside Tom in their bed, her mind racing through scenarios both hopeful and terrifying. What if they succeeded in bringing this story to light? What if the Beaumont family's reputation was destroyed, their legacy of philanthropy revealed as blood money? What if other families in New Orleans, other cities across the South, had similar secrets? What if this was just one small piece of a much larger pattern of oppression that continued in different forms, even today? But what if they failed? What if the people sending threatening texts had the power to silence them permanently? What if the institutional forces protecting the Beaumont name were too strong to overcome? What if, after all their effort, the truth remained buried and those faces in the photograph were forgotten again? Sarah realized that her insomnia, her fear, her compulsive questioning, they were all symptoms of understanding how precarious freedom really was. It wasn't a guarantee, wasn't something that once achieved remained permanent. It had to be defended constantly, fought for in every generation, protected against those who would restrict or eliminate it for their own gain. The people in that photograph had been legally free, emancipated by law, but that hadn't protected them. Freedom required more than legislation. It required vigilance, courage, and the willingness to confront ugly truths. The following morning, Sarah and Marcus met in Helen Carr's office as ordered. She sat behind her large mahogany desk, a desk that probably cost more than Sarah's car, and regarded them with cold disapproval. "You've both been with this archive long enough to know that reliability is essential. Your unexplained absence yesterday was unacceptable." "I apologize," Marcus said calmly. "It won't happen again." Helen's expression didn't soften. "See that it doesn't. Now, where are we with the Beaumont collection? I need your catalogue completed by the end of the week." Sarah felt Marcus tense beside her. They'd barely begun processing the collection, had been so focused on the photograph that they'd neglected the hundreds of other documents. "We've made significant progress," Sarah said carefully. "We've found some very interesting materials that might require additional research before we can properly catalogue them." "Interesting how?" Helen asked sharply. "Historical significance," Marcus interjected. "Potential connections to events and people not previously documented in our collection. We want to ensure we're thorough." Helen studied them both, her gaze penetrating. "The Beaumont family has requested a private viewing of whatever items we select for exhibition. They want to approve anything bearing their name before it goes public. That's standard for major donors. So whatever you think you've found, run it by me first. We don't want any misunderstandings." The threat was clear, though couched in professional language. Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, but forced it down. "Of course," she said smoothly. "We'll keep you informed of any significant discoveries." After they left Helen's office, Marcus let out a long breath. "She knows, or suspects at least. The Beaumont family must have influence here," Sarah said quietly as they walked back to the basement. "They probably have people on the board. Maybe even Helen reports directly to them. Which means we can't work on this here anymore," Marcus concluded. "Everything we do from now on has to be outside the archive, using our own resources. They spent the rest of that day maintaining appearances, going through routine cataloguing of mundane documents, while carefully avoiding any further examination of the controversial photograph. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere, planning their next moves, thinking about how to build an unassailable case. That evening, she met with Tom and Marcus at her house in Mid-City. Tom had brought files he'd requested from his newspaper's archives, old records that wouldn't be available digitally. They spread them across Sarah's dining room table and began cross-referencing everything they knew about the Beaumont family, the 1892 fire, and the people who'd disappeared. What they discovered was a pattern that extended far beyond a single warehouse incident. Between 1889 and 1895, hundreds of formerly enslaved people disappeared from New Orleans and surrounding parishes. Official records attributed the losses to disease outbreaks, migration to northern cities, and simple record-keeping failures. But Tom's research had uncovered something else. Nearly all the disappearances occurred around the same time as shipments from the Beaumont Shipping Company to labor camps in Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi. They were running an underground slave trade, Tom said, his voice tight with controlled anger. 3 decades after the Civil War, they were still trafficking people, still treating human beings as commodities. And they did it with the complicity of local authorities, business partners, and probably half the political establishment. Marcus pulled up a spreadsheet he'd been building. I've been tracking the Beaumont family's business connections in the 1890s. They had partnerships with plantation owners, prison labor contractors, mining operations. All industries that relied on cheap, expendable workers. It's not just about the individuals they trafficked, it's about an entire economic system built on exploitation. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were uncovering. This isn't just one family's crime, she said quietly. This is systemic. This is about how power operates, how it protects itself across generations. Tom nodded. And that's exactly why it matters. That's why this story needs to be told, because these same systems exist today in different forms. Private prisons, exploitative labor practices, immigration detention centers. The faces change, the methods change, but the fundamental disregard for human freedom continues. They worked late into the night, building their case, documenting connections, creating a narrative that would be impossible to dismiss. By 3 a.m, they had a preliminary report. 40 pages of documented evidence linking the Beaumont family to widespread human trafficking, arson, murder, and decades of systematic cover-up. It was damning, thorough, and terrifying in its implications. Sarah finally fell asleep on the couch around 4, Tom beside her, Marcus in the guest room. She dreamed of the photograph, of those 5 brothers standing in their chains, of the faces in the windows behind them. But in her dream, they were speaking, telling her their names, their stories, their hopes. They weren't just victims anymore. They were people, fully realized and demanding to be seen. She woke to her phone ringing. The screen showed Helen Carr's name. Sarah's stomach clenched as she answered. "Hello?" Helen's voice was formal, official. "Sarah, I need you to come to the archive immediately. There's been an incident. What kind of incident? The Beaumont collection has been removed. The family sent representatives last night with legal authorization to reclaim it. Everything is gone." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "They can't do that. The collection was donated. It's public record now." "Apparently, there was a clause in the donation agreement," Helen said coldly. "Material could be reclaimed if it was deemed potentially damaging to the family's reputation. The board approved the removal." "I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do." After Helen hung up, Sarah sat in stunned silence. Tom and Marcus had woken during the call and were watching her with concern. "They took it," she said flatly. "They took everything, all the documents, all the photographs. It's all gone." Not everything, Marcus said quickly. We have the digital scans. We have Josephine's testimony. We have our research. They can't erase what we've already documented. But without the physical evidence, without the actual photograph, Sarah protested. Who's going to believe us? Tom stood up, his journalistic instincts taking over. We make them believe us. We publish our findings. We go public with everything we have. We force the story into the open where it can't be suppressed. They'll destroy us, Sarah said. Our careers, our reputations, they have that power. Tom knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. Maybe they do. But we have something more powerful. We have the truth. And we have the voices of people who've been silenced for over a century. We owe them this. We owe it to Josephine's grandmother. We owe it to the Beaumont brothers who died trying to do what we're doing now. Sarah looked at Marcus, who nodded. Tom's right. We've come too far to back down now. This is about more than just us. This is about justice. This is about freedom. Real freedom. Not just the legal kind, but freedom from the systems and structures that keep people oppressed. That morning they made their decision. Tom would write the story for the Times-Picayune, using their credibility and legal protections to shield them from immediate retaliation. Sarah and Marcus would write a scholarly article for a major historical journal, presenting their findings to the academic community, and they would reach out to Josephine, see if she would be willing to go public with her grandmother's testimony, to be the human face of this forgotten tragedy. The next several days were a blur of activity. Tom worked with his editors, who were initially skeptical but became increasingly convinced as they reviewed the evidence. Sarah and Marcus contacted historians across the country, building a network of scholars who could verify their research and provide context. And Josephine, brave and determined despite her age, agreed to tell her story on camera, to make sure her grandmother's suffering and survival were honored. The threats escalated. Anonymous emails warned them to stop. Sarah's car was vandalized. Marcus received a call from someone claiming his daughter was being watched, but they also received support. Other descendants of trafficking victims came forward with their own family stories. Historians who'd encountered similar suppressed narratives offered their expertise, and slowly, inevitably, the truth began to emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for so long. Tom's article ran on a Sunday, spread across the entire front page of the Times-Picayune. The headline read, "The Warehouse of Chains: How One New Orleans Family Built Their Fortune on Trafficking Freed Slaves." Below, it was the enhanced photograph of the 5 Beaumont brothers, their chains visible, the faces in the windows finally seen and acknowledged. Josephine's face was there too, her grandmother's story told in her own words. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By Tuesday, the Louisiana Attorney General announced an investigation into the Beaumont family's historical activities and their influence on state institutions. By Wednesday, protests had formed outside the Beaumont Foundation's headquarters, descendants of trafficking victims demanding acknowledgement and reparations. The Beaumont family fought back, of course. They hired expensive lawyers, issued denials, claimed the photograph was fabricated or misinterpreted, but the evidence was too strong, the documentation too thorough, the testimonies too compelling. One by one, their defenses crumbled. Board members resigned. University buildings bearing the Beaumont name were renamed. Scholarships funded by the family's wealth were redirected to organizations supporting descendants of enslaved and trafficked people. Sarah and Marcus were fired from the archive, as expected. Helen Carr cited insubordination and misuse of institutional resources. But they'd anticipated this. Tom's newspaper offered Sarah a position as a historical researcher. Marcus was hired by a university in Atlanta that wanted to establish a new center for studying suppressed histories. Their careers weren't destroyed. They were transformed, given new purpose and direction. But the real victory came months later, when the state of Louisiana officially recognized the Beaumont warehouse fire as a mass murder and trafficking operation, when the names of the victims, including the 5 brothers and all 30 imprisoned people, were added to a memorial in Congo Square. Josephine was there for the dedication, now 87, standing straight and proud as the names were read aloud. Her grandmother's name, Estelle Winters, was among them, no longer forgotten, no longer erased. Sarah stood beside Josephine that day, Tom on her other side, Marcus and his daughter Amy behind them. The November sun was warm on their faces as speaker after speaker talked about freedom, about justice, about the importance of confronting painful truths. Sarah thought about the photograph, about how a simple image from 1892 had changed so many lives in the present. She thought about the Beaumont brothers who'd chosen to stand with the oppressed even when it cost them everything. She thought about Josephine's grandmother who'd survived and made sure her story would outlive her. Freedom wasn't free, Sarah understood now. It was purchased with courage, with sacrifice, with the willingness to speak truth, even in the face of powerful opposition. It had to be defended in every generation, fought for by ordinary people who refused to let injustice be normalized or forgotten. The systems of oppression were resilient, adaptive, always finding new forms, but so was resistance, so was the human desire for dignity and liberation. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, an elderly man approached them. He was perhaps 90, leaning heavily on a cane, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He introduced himself as Robert Beaumont, a distant descendant of the brothers in the photograph. "I wanted to thank you," he said to Sarah and Marcus, "for telling the truth about my ancestors. Not the lie that's been perpetuated for generations, but the real truth, that they were heroes, that they tried to do what was right." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You knew?" Robert nodded slowly. "My grandmother told me before she died. She was Thomas Beaumont's daughter, born before the fire. She said her father and uncles were good men who stood up to evil, even when it was their own family. But she was told never to speak of it, that it would bring shame on the family name. She kept that silence her whole life, and I kept it after her. I'm ashamed of that now. Ashamed that I chose reputation over truth." "It's never too late to choose differently," Marcus said gently. "Your story, your family's real story, it matters too. The complexity matters. That even in a family built on exploitation, there were people who resisted, who chose differently." Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is a letter Thomas Beaumont wrote to his daughter the night before he freed the captives. He knew what would happen, knew his father would kill him for it, but he wrote to her anyway, explaining why he had to do it. Why freedom mattered more than family loyalty, more than wealth, more than his own life. I want you to have it. I want it to be part of the record." Sarah accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Later at home she would read Thomas Beaumont's words to his daughter, and they would become the epigraph for her book about the case. The book that would win prizes and change how people thought about Reconstruction-era New Orleans. But in that moment, standing in Congo Square with the sun setting over the city, she simply held the letter and understood that the work of recovering truth was never finished, that there were always more stories to uncover, more voices to amplify, more injustices to address. Tom squeezed her hand, and she looked at him, seeing pride and love in his eyes. They'd paid a price for this, both of them. Their lives had been upended, threatened, transformed. But they'd also gained something immeasurable. They'd helped restore dignity to people who'd been erased. They'd exposed systems of oppression that continued to operate in different forms. They'd honored the courage of those 5 brothers who'd stood in chains and documented their own imprisonment, trusting that someday someone would see and understand. As they walked back to their car through the quarter's narrow streets, past buildings that had stood for centuries, Sarah thought about all the stories contained in those brick walls, all the truths waiting to be discovered. New Orleans was a city built on layers of history, some celebrated, some suppressed, all of them essential to understanding who we are and how we got here. The work of excavating those layers, of bringing hidden truths to light, would continue long after she was gone, but she'd done her part. She'd refused to look away. That night, Sarah sat at her laptop and began writing. Not the academic article or the book proposal, but something more personal, a letter to the 5 Beaumont brothers, to Josephine's grandmother, to all 30 people who died in that warehouse fire. She thanked them for their courage. She promised that their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten, that their story would be told and retold, that the freedom they'd died for would continue to be defended. She acknowledged that the work was far from finished, that systems of oppression had evolved but not disappeared, that vigilance was still required. But she also wrote about hope, about how their story had inspired people across the country to examine their own histories, to confront their own communities' suppressed narratives, about how descendants of both the oppressed and the oppressors had come together to demand truth and reconciliation, about how the photograph that had made archivists flee in terror had ultimately become a symbol of resistance, of the power of documentation, of the importance of bearing witness. Sarah never sent the letter, of course. It remained in her files, a private meditation on freedom and responsibility, but its sentiments guided her work for the rest of her life. She became one of the nation's leading experts on suppressed histories, helping communities across America uncover and acknowledge their own painful truths. She testified before Congress about the need for truth and reconciliation processes similar to those in post-apartheid South Africa. She trained a new generation of archivists and historians to approach their work with both rigor and compassion, to understand that every document, every photograph, every artifact represented real human lives and deserved to be treated with care. Marcus became equally influential in his field, his work on the Beaumont case establishing new methodologies for digital analysis of historical materials. He developed techniques that helped authenticate and enhance thousands of photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revealing details that had been invisible for generations. His collaboration with descendant communities became a model for ethical historical research, demonstrating how scholarship could serve justice rather than simply academic curiosity. Josephine lived another 5 years after the Congo Square dedication, long enough to see her grandmother's story taught in schools across Louisiana, long enough to attend the opening of the Estelle Winters Community Center in the 9th Ward, long enough to know that the silence had been broken permanently. When she died at 92, her funeral was attended by hundreds, including Sarah, Marcus, and Tom, all of whom spoke about how her courage and her grandmother's resilience had changed their lives and their understanding of what freedom requires. The Beaumont family never fully recovered their reputation, though some members, like Robert, worked to make amends through reparations and public acknowledgement of their ancestors' crimes. Others remained defiant, insisting the historical evidence was biased or incomplete, that their family's philanthropic legacy should outweigh past misdeeds. The debates continued, sometimes heated, always revealing deeper truths about how societies remember and forget, about who gets to write history and whose voices get amplified or suppressed. But the photograph remained, digitally preserved and widely circulated, those 5 brothers and the faces behind them finally seen and honored. It hung in museums and appeared in textbooks. It became an icon of both the persistent evil of human trafficking and the persistent hope that good people would resist evil, even at great personal cost. And every time someone looked at it, really looked at it, zooming in to see the details that had been hidden for over a century, they were reminded that freedom is never guaranteed, never permanent, always requiring courage to defend and truth to sustain. Years later, when Sarah was invited to speak at the New Orleans Historical Archive, now under new leadership committed to transparency and community engagement, she stood in the same basement where she'd first discovered the photograph. The room had been renovated, modernized, but the brick walls were the same, the stone steps unchanged. She could still remember the August humidity, the fluorescent lights humming, the moment when she'd first noticed something odd about that family portrait. In her speech, she talked about that moment as a turning point, not just in her career, but in her understanding of what history meant, why it mattered, who it served. She talked about the responsibility that came with accessing the past, the obligation to honor those who couldn't speak for themselves, the importance of using privilege and position to amplify marginalized voices. And she talked about freedom, real freedom, the kind that required constant vigilance and courage, the kind that was never truly secure as long as systems of oppression remained intact. The audience, made up of archivists, historians, students, and community members, listened intently. When Sarah finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. But what moved her most was seeing, in the front row, a young black woman, no more than 25, with a notebook filled with careful notes and tears streaming down her face. After the speech, the woman approached her. "My name is Estelle," she said. "Estelle Winters. I'm named after my great-great-grandmother, the woman who survived that warehouse fire. Because of what you did, because you told her story, I know where I come from. I know what she survived. I know that I'm here because she was brave, and because some people chose to stand with her, even when it cost them everything. Thank you for giving me that knowledge. Thank you for giving me that freedom." Sarah embraced the young woman, understanding in that moment that this was why the work mattered, not for acclaim or recognition, but for the Estelles of the world, for the descendants who deserved to know their full histories, for the future generations who would continue the fight for freedom and justice. The photograph had been a window into the past, but it was also a mirror for the present, reflecting back the ongoing struggles against oppression, the continuing need for courage and solidarity, the eternal truth that freedom requires defenders in every age. As Sarah left the archive that evening, walking out into the New Orleans twilight, she thought about those 5 brothers one more time: Thomas, William, James, Robert, and Edward Beaumont. They'd had everything to lose, and they'd lost it all, but they'd gained something too. Something that outlasted wealth or reputation or family legacy. They'd gained integrity. They'd gained the knowledge that they'd stood on the right side of history, that they'd chosen human dignity over profit, that they'd honored the fundamental truth that all people deserve freedom. Sarah looked up at the sky, at the first stars appearing in the gathering darkness, and she made a silent promise to those brothers, to Josephine's grandmother, to all the people whose stories she'd helped recover over the years. She promised to keep telling the truth, to keep fighting against suppression and erasure, to keep defending the freedom that so many had died for. It was a promise she would keep until her last breath, a promise that she hoped others would take up when she was gone. Because that's how freedom survives, not through laws alone, not through declarations or constitutions, but through the daily choices of ordinary people to stand for truth, to resist oppression, to honor the dignity of every human being. The photograph from 1892 had taught her that. The faces in those windows, the chains around those brothers' necks, they were reminders that freedom is fragile, that it must be protected, that it's worth any sacrifice. And as she walked through the French Quarter, past buildings that held centuries of stories both beautiful and terrible, Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility and the joy of that purpose. She was free, truly free, because she'd chosen to use her freedom to liberate others, to bring light to darkness, to make sure that no one's suffering was forgotten, no one's courage ignored, no one's humanity denied. That was the real legacy of the photograph, the real meaning of what they'd uncovered. Not just a historical discovery, but a call to action that echoed across time, demanding that each generation answer the question, will you stand for freedom? Will you tell the truth? Will you be counted among those who resisted? Sarah's answer was yes. It always had been, from the moment she'd first seen those faces in the shadows, those chains around those necks, that desperate plea for help scratched into a wall. And it always would be, as long as there were stories to uncover, truths to tell, and freedom to defend. The archivists had fled in terror when they zoomed closer to that 1892 photograph, but Sarah had chosen to look even closer, to see everything, to document it all, to make sure the world knew. And in making that choice, she'd honored the memory of everyone who'd ever fought for freedom, everyone who'd ever refused to look away from injustice, everyone who'd ever believed that truth mattered more than comfort or safety or reputation. That was her legacy. That was her freedom. And as she disappeared into the vibrant New Orleans night, just another figure among thousands walking those historic streets, she carried with her the voices of the dead and the hopes of the living, bound together by the unbreakable conviction that every human being deserves dignity, that every story deserves to be told, and that freedom, real freedom, is always worth fighting for.